Hello learners, welcome to the last part of video discussion of Unit 9. And the title of the video discussion is A Process and Challenges of Inclusive Assessment. In our previous discussion, we have talked about the concepts and different related aspects of inclusive assessment, which is an important part of inclusive education. So, inclusive education has emerged as a central pillar of contemporary educational reform, grounded in the principles of equity, social justice, and respect for learners' diversity. It seeks to ensure that all learners, regardless of disability, gender, socioeconomic background, language, ethnicity, or learning differences, have equitable access to meaningful learning opportunities, as we already have discussed all this. Within this framework, assessment plays a critical role, as we already discussed, as it not only measures learning outcomes but also shapes teaching practices, learner motivation, and educational trajectories. Traditional assessment systems, often standardized rigid, have historically marginalized learners who do not conform to dominate norms of learning and expression. These systems tend to privilege certain cognitive styles, linguistic competencies, and socio-cultural capital, thereby reinforcing exclusion rather than mitigating it. In response, inclusive assessment has gained prominence as a learner centered, flexible, and responsive approach that recognizes diversity as a strength rather than a deficit. Inclusive assessment aligns closely with international frameworks such as the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disabilities, UNESCO's Education 2030 agenda, and national policies like India's National Education Policy NEP 2020, which emphasizes competency based, formative, and holistic assessment. This note critically examines the approaches to inclusive assessment and the challenges encountered in its implementation, highlighting theoretical perspectives, practices, strategies, and contextual realities. Now, let's discuss the conceptual understanding of inclusive assessment again. Inclusive assessment refers to assessment practices that are designed, implemented, and interpreted in ways that accommodate learner diversity, reduce barriers to participation, and promote equitable learning outcomes. It removes beyond merely providing accommodations to a few learners and instead focuses on designing assessment systems that are inherently accessible to all. What are the key principles of inclusive assessment? Again, I am repeating or revising about the principles of inclusive assessment. Inclusive assessment is grounded in the principle of equity and fairness, which prioritizes providing every learner with what they need to demonstrate learning rather than treating all learners in the same way. Unlike uniform assessment practices that apply theoretical tools and criteria to all students, inclusive assessment acknowledges that learners come from diverse linguistic, cultural, cognitive, and socioeconomic backgrounds. Fairness, therefore, lies in removing barriers and creating opportunities that allow each learner to succeed according to their abilities and circumstances. Flexibility is a core element of inclusive assessment. This includes adapting assessment methods, tools, formats, and timing to suit diverse learner needs. For instance, learners may be given choices between written, oral, visual, or performance based assessment, extended time, or assistive technologies such as flexibility ensures that assessment measures learning outcomes rather than limitation arising from disability, language barrier, or anxiety. Inclusive assessment also involves the recognition of diverse way of knowing and expressing learning. Learners may construct and demonstrate knowledge through storytelling and projects, presentations, portfolios, or practical tasks. Valuing multiple forms of expression respects individual strength and promotes deeper engagement with learning. Learner participation and agency are essential to inclusive assessment practices. When learners are involved in goal setting, self assessment, and peer assessment, they develop ownership of their learning process. This participatory approach enhances motivation, self regulation, and metacognitive skills. Finally, inclusive assessment emphasizes a formative and developmental orientation, focusing on continuous feedback and improvement rather than high stocks judgment. Aligned with frameworks such as universal design for learning, differentiated instruction and assessment for learning, inclusive assessment supports ongoing growth, reflection, and lifelong learning for all learners. So, already we have discussed what are the theoretical foundation of inclusive assessment. So, what were the theoretical foundation? First of all, it was constructivist learning theory. Constructivism posits that learners actively construct knowledge-based prior experiences, cultural context, and individual abilities. Inclusive assessment grounded in constructivism values process oriented evaluation, reflection, and authentic task over the rote memorization. Universal design for learning. UDL or Universal Design for Learning provides a framework for designing assessment that offer multiple means of representation, varied formats of content, multiple means of action and expression, diverse ways of demonstrate learning, then multiple means of engagement, motivational flexibility. Then sociocultural theory. Rooted in Vygotskian perspective, this theory emphasizes learner interaction, scaffolding, and the zone of proximal development. Inclusive assessment recognizes collaborative learning, peer assessment, and contextualized tasks. Right-based approach. Inclusive assessment is also informed by rights-based perspective, viewing equitable assessment as an educational rights rather than a pedagogical choice. This approach challenges deficit-based models of disability and difference. Approaches to inclusive assessment. First of all, formative assessment. Formative assessment is a cornerstone of inclusive assessment. It involves continuous monitoring of learner progress through observation, quizzes, exit tickets, reflective journals, or oral questioning. Inclusive value. Formative assessment allows teachers to identify learning gaps early, adapt instruction, and provide timely feedback tailored to inclusive needs. It reduces anxiety associated with high stocks testing and supports diverse learners, including slow learners and learners with disabilities. Differentiated assessment. Differentiated assessment recognizes that learners vary in readiness, interest, learning styles, and abilities. It involves modifying content. What is assessed? Process. How assessment occurs. Product. How learners demonstrate learning. Say, for example, choice-based assignment, tiered task, alternative assessment formats such as oral, visual, written, etc. inclusive value. Differentiation promotes learner autonomy and respects individual strength while maintaining common learning goals. Authentic assessment. Authentic assessment focuses on real life meaningful tasks such as projects, case studies, portfolios, presentations, field based assignments. Then inclusive values. Such assessments are culturally responsive and allows learners to connect academic and knowledge with lived experiences, making them spatially valuable for marginalized and first generation learners. Portfolio assessment. Portfolios involve systematic collections of learner work over time, showcasing progress, reflection, and achievement. Inclusive value. Portfolios value growth rather than one time performance and are particularly effective for learners with disabilities, creative learners, and those with taste anxiety. Self and peer assessment. Self and peer assessment encourage learners to reflect on their learning and evaluate others' work using clear criteria. Inclusive value. These approaches foster metacognition, responsibility, and social learning while empowering learners as active participants in the assessment process. Technology enable inclusive assessment. Digital tools support inclusive assessment through assistive technologies, screen readers, speech to text, etc. Online quizzes with flexible timing, multimedia submissions, learning analytical and personalized feedback. So, next, inclusive value. Technology enhances accessibility, especially for learners with visual, hearing, or mobility impairments, and supports distance and blended learning context. Accommodations and modifications. Inclusive assessment also includes reasonable accommodations such as extra time, alternative formats like braille and audio, use of scribes or readers, simplified language without reducing rigor. Then inclusive value. This measures ensures fairness without compromising learning standards. Role of teachers in inclusive assessment. Teachers are central to success of inclusive assessment. Their responsibilities include designing flexible assessment tasks, identifying learner needs through continuous assessment, providing constructive and timely feedback, collaborative with special educators, parents, and supporting staff, and reflecting on assessment practices to reduce bias. Professional competency in inclusive assessment literacy is essential. Teachers must understand learner diversity, assessment design, implementation of results, and ethical consideration. Now, the main thing has to come, the challenges of inclusive assessment. Despite its promises, inclusive assessment faces numerous challenges at policy, institutional, and classroom level in everywhere. Rigid examination oriented system. This is the first the challenge. Rigid examination oriented systems continue to dominate many education frameworks, shaping teaching and learning practices in narrow and restrictive ways. By prioritizing standardized, high stock summative examination, these systems places excessive emphasis on ranking and comparison rather than meaningful learning. Success is often measured through marks and grades, encouraging competition instead of collaboration and deep understanding. As a result, learners may focus on rote memorization and exam oriented preparation rather than developing critical thinking, creativity, and problem solving skills. Such systems also undermine the role of formative assessment, which is essential for continuous feedback and improvement. Teachers, constrained by rigid syllabi and examination schedules, have limited opportunities to assess learners' progress holistically or adapt instruction to individual needs. Formative practices like self assessment, peer feedback, projects, and reflective tasks are often sidelined, reducing assessment to a one time adjustment rather than an ongoing learning process. Moreover, examination oriented systems tend to marginalize diverse learners, including students with disabilities, different learning styles, linguistic backgrounds, or socioeconomic challenges. Uniform assessment formats fail to accommodate varied ways of demonstrating knowledge, thereby reinforcing inequities. Learners who do not perform well in time written exams are often labeled as weak, regardless of their actual abilities or potentialities. Overall, rigid examination systems hinder inclusive education and limit the transformative role of assessment as a tool for equity, growth, and learner development. Then another problem or challenges is lack of teacher training. The lack of adequate teacher training remains one of the most critical barriers to effective inclusive education. Many teachers enter classrooms with strong subject knowledge and a genuine commitment to students' welfare, yet they often lack systematic training in inclusive pedagogy. Inclusive pedagogy requires an understanding of learner diversity, differentiated instruction, and strategies that address varied cognitive, sensory, linguistic, and socio emotional needs. Without this foundation, teachers may rely on uniform teaching methods that unintentionally marginalized learners who require alternate approaches. Similarly, limited training in assessment adaptation restrict teachers' ability to design flexible and fair evaluation practices. Standardized tests and rigid assessment formats may disadvantage learners with disabilities, learning difficulties, or language barriers. When the teachers are unaware of accommodations such as modified tasks, extended time, or alternative modes of expression, assessment becomes a tool of exclusion rather than a means of supporting learning. The sufficient use of assistive technologies further compounds this issue. Many teachers are unfamiliar with digital tools, screen readers, then captioning software or adaptive learning platforms that can significantly enhance accessibility. As a result, learners who depend on such support remains undeserved. Then, consequently, despite positive intention, teachers may unknowingly reinforce exclusionary practices. This highlights the urgent need for continuous professional development focused on inclusive teaching, adaptive assessment, and assistive technology integration to ensure equitable learning opportunities for all students. Then another challenge may be time constraints and workload. Designing and implementing inclusive assessment is time intensive. Teachers face large class sizes, administrative burdens, limited planning time. As a result, inclusive practices may be perceived as impractical. Resource and infrastructure limitation is another challenge. Inclusive assessment requires access to assistive devices, digital platforms, support staff like special educators, counselor, etc. In rural and under-resourced contexts, these remain significant barriers. Then, attitudinal barriers. Negative attitudes, stereotypes, and deficit thinking about learners with disabilities or marginalized backgrounds continue to influence assessment practices. These attitudes may result in low expectations, over accommodations, or under challenge bias in grading. Language and cultural bias. Language and cultural bias in assessment tools pose significant challenges in equity and fairness in education. Many assessments are designed around dominant linguistic styles, cultural references, and modes of expression that align with mainstreams or majority groups. As a result, learners from linguistically diverse, indigenous, or marginalized cultural backgrounds may be unfairly disadvantaged, not due to lack of knowledge or ability, but because the assessment frameworks does not reflect their lived experiences or ways of communication. Simply translating assessment materials into different languages is often insufficient, as cultural meanings, idiomatic expression, and contextual relevance may still remain inaccessible or misleading. Without cultural sensitivity, translations can distort intent and fail to capture learners' true understanding. Inclusive assessment therefore requires culturally responsive design where tasks acknowledge diverse worldviews, value multiple forms of expressions, and minimize cultural assumptions. Such an approach enhances validity, reduces bias, and promotes more accurate representation of learners' competencies. Then, policy practice gap. The policy practice gap in inclusive assessment highlights the disconnect between a well articulated educational policies and their actual implementation at the ground level. While national and institutional policy documents strongly emphasize inclusive and equitable assessment practices, their translation into classroom realities often remain uneven and fragmented. One major factor contributing to this gap is the lack of effective monitoring mechanisms. Policies may outline inclusive assessment strategies, but without systematic supervision, evaluation, and feedback, institutions and educators are rarely guided or compelled to follow them consistently. As a result, inclusive assessment remains more aspirational than operational. Secondly, insufficient institutional support significantly weakens implementation. Many educational institutions lack adequate resources such as trained personnel, assistive technologies, flexible assessment tools, and time for teacher collaboration. Without administrative backing and infrastructural readiness, teachers often revert to traditional exam centric assessment methods that are easier to administer but less inclusive. Finally, weak accountability mechanisms further widen the gap. When there are no clear responsibilities, performance indicators, or consequences linked to inclusive assessment practices, compliance becomes optional rather than obligatory. This absence of accountability reduces motivation among stockholders to adopt innovative and learner centered assessment approach. Together, these factors underscore the need for stronger monitoring systems, sustained institutional investment, and robust accountability frameworks to ensure that inclusive assessment policies lead to meaningful and equitable practices. Inclusive assessment in this regard, Indian context, I mentioned some discussion point here that inclusive assessment in the Indian context has gained renewed attention in recent years, particularly with the shift towards equity, accessibility, and learner centered education. A major policy influence in the National Education Policy 2020, which strongly advocates competency based assessment over rote memorization. NEP 2020 emphasizes formative assessment, continuous feedback, and the evaluation of higher order thinking skills, thereby creating space for diverse learners to demonstrate understanding in multiple ways. This policy shift aligns assessment with learning outcomes rather than mere examination performance. Another crucial legislative framework shaping inclusive assessment in the Right of Persons with Disabilities Act 2016. The Act mandates reasonable accommodations such as extra time, use of assistive technologies, alternative formats, braille, large print, digital text, and scribes for learners with disabilities. It legally reinforces the principle that assessment systems must adapt to learners' needs rather than expecting learners to conform to rigid assessment structure. Further examination reforms initiated by CBSE and CRT universities have attempted to introduce flexibility through internal assessment, project based evaluation, competency focused questions, and multiple assessment opportunities. These reforms aim to reduce exam stress and promote inclusive and holistic evaluation practices across school and the higher educational system. Despite this progressive development, several challenges continue to hinder effective implementation. India's deeply rooted examination centric culture prioritizes high stocks testing, often undermining inclusive and formative assessment practices. Regional disparities in infrastructure, resources, and administrative capacity create uneven implementation across states and institutions. Additionally, limited teacher preparedness of inclusive assessment literacy restricts the effective use of differentiated and adaptive assessment strategies. The digital divide, particularly evident in open and distance learning system, further exacerbates inequity by limiting access to online assessment tools and assistive technologies. Addressing these challenges requires sustained policy support, teacher training, and investment in inclusive education and infrastructure. So, the next point is strategies to strengthening inclusive assessment. Strengthening inclusive assessment requires a systematic and multi-level approach that addresses teacher capacity, institutional readiness, learner diversity, and policy alignment. Continuous professional development for teachers is fundamental to this process. Teachers must be regularly trained in inclusive assessment practices, differentiated evaluation methods, and accommodation for learners with diverse needs, including disabilities, language barriers, and sociocultural differences. Such training enhances teachers' assessment literacy and reduces unconscious bias in evaluation. Institutional support and leadership commitment play a crucial role in sustaining inclusive assessment practices. School leaders and administrators must establish inclusive assessment as a core institutional value by providing resources, encouraging collaboration among teachers, and creating supportive policies. Leadership commitment ensures that inclusive assessment is not an individual effort but a shared responsibility across the institution. The integration of universal design for learning principles in curriculum and assessment design promotes flexibility and accessibility. UDL encourages multiple means of representation, expression, and engagement, allowing learners to demonstrate their understanding in varied ways. This approach reduces barriers to assessment and support equitable participation for the learners. Investment in technology and assistive resources further strengthen inclusive assessment. Digital tools, screen readers, speech to text software, and adaptive testing platforms enable learners with special needs to access assessment on an equal footing. Technology also facilitates personalized feedback and formative assessment. Learner and parent awareness programs are essential for building understanding and acceptance of inclusive assessment practices. When learners and parents are informed about the assessment, accommodation, and inclusive goals, collaboration and trust increase. Finally, resource and data driven policy decision ensures that inclusive assessment practices are continuously improved. Evidence based policies help institutions identify gaps, measures impact, and implement sustainable reforms aligned with the inclusive education education goals. So these are about inclusive assessment, its challenges, its theoretical background, and in the concluding part, I can say that inclusive assessment is not merely a pedagogical strategy but a moral and ethical imperative aligned with the goals of inclusive education and social justice. By recognizing learner diversity, promoting flexibility, and emphasizing growth over comparison, inclusive assessment contributes to more equitable and meaningful educational experiences. So, these are the about inclusive education. So while significant challenges remain, particularly in terms of systemic rigidity, resource constraints, and teacher preparedness, the potential benefit of inclusive assessment far outweighed these limitations. Moving forward is sustained commitment from policymakers, institutions, educators, and committees is essential to transform assessment into a powerful tool for inclusion, empowerment, and lifelong learning. Thank you.